Everyone, and welcome to a new session of NTalks second edition. Today we'll focus on a topic that is often underestimated but absolutely essential: how we communicate innovation. In the EU projects, it is not enough to develop great solutions. We also need to make them visible, understandable, and useful to others. That's where communication, dissemination, and of course the stakeholders' engagement come in. In this session, we will explore how these strategies help to turn innovation into real impacts. We are very pleased to welcome Jacqueline Heinze from Steinbeis Europa Zentrum, who has been helping EU projects share and communicate innovation more effectively. She will guide us through the main concepts, common challenge, and best practice when it comes to making innovation more visible and accessible. So, Jacqueline, welcome again, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the nice introduction, first of all, and welcome to all participants. And I'll be very happy to spend the next, 30 to 40 minutes with you as we say, closure of the workday in Germany. So very happy to have you here. I'll just share my presentation. Just a second. Are you seeing the right screen is the question.
No. Not right now.
I'll try again, just a second.
We used to see it at first. We could see it.
Maybe now?
Yes.
Did it work? Oh, okay, perfect. Yes. So again, thank you for having me today. So my topic is a little bit outside the box today. So it's about communicating innovation. And to say this, first of all, in EU projects, and this is what I'll be focusing on today because it is our line of work. Actually, communication on innovation also always means communication on science, so science communication. First of all, let me give you a little bit of background on my company and who I am. So my name is Jacqueline. As Luis has already said, I'm working as a project manager at Steinbeis Europa Zentrum, which is a consultancy company with an expertise in EU-funded projects for a couple of years already, as you can see. So we've been active in EU projects for 35 years. We have done over 80 projects per year, so quite a lot of, let's say, turnover and a little bit of a different kind. And in this, we've also taken up different roles and different topics, and I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what these topics are. So they range from digitalization, Industry 4.0, which is my focus area, but to health as well as agriculture, bioeconomy, or environment. So very different research topics, and of course, communication changes a lot depending on the topic, depending on the target audiences, but I will come to that in detail a little bit later. Also, to give you a little bit of an overview, what do we actually do in those projects? As I said before, we are not a research organization, so we are a consultancy company, and we have a lot of expertise in managing EU projects. So we are mostly in the administration and project management, but we also take up the role of communicator in these projects. And this is why I'm here today, to introduce you to that role and what it entails. Also, I've talked about target audiences right before, so just to give you an idea of whom we're working with, which is also quite varied. So mostly it's universities and research institutes, as well as companies, but we also have networks of policy stakeholders, clusters and networks, so also quite varied. I already said what we are not. So actually, when I'm introducing the company, I usually see a lot of question marks of what we're actually doing. So I took on the habit of saying what we are not to differentiate ourselves also from other companies, maybe, or institutes. So we're not a research organization. We are not the European Commission or part of the European Commission. We are not a startup, and we're not a design agency. But we do communicate between all of those stakeholders. So our job is very much a moderation and intermediate role as a communicator. First question, why should we even communicate about innovation and science? There's, of course, different aspects to this. So one of the most straightforward ones is actually that we want to bridge the gap between society and science. What does that mean? Scientists normally work in their line of work. They usually don't by themselves maybe have an interest of communicating that science to a broader audience beyond their own research field or beyond the academic field. And that's where we come into play. So when we are in EU projects, our job is also to make that science accessible for a wider circle, which includes very generally the public, so citizens as you and me are, but also, of course, maybe clusters. It could be policy stakeholders. It could also be scientists from other fields that are not related to the one we are working in. So our job is very much to make that science relatable to them, to make it maybe relevant for them, to kind of point out what the connections to this field might be, and to make it accessible. So to give them the access to the knowledge that we generate in the project. No problem about the delay. Happy to have you here, Francisco. Another aspect of the why of the communication is actually to build trust and prevent misinformation. I think this has become quite known since the Trump times, but it was, of course, also there before. So there's a lot of information flooding around in the World Wide Web and everywhere else. So it's also about debunking myths, about clarifying scientific concepts, for example, and also fostering so-called scientific literacy. So the ability to differentiate between scientific information and non-scientifically founded information, which can sound very similar and can be very confusing to somebody who's not used to being a deadline of work. So this is also part of our job as communicators. A third aspect is actually also to foster science collaboration. By making science public and by making it visible, we actually can foster science collaboration because other researchers get to know of the research and the findings that we have in an EU project. And it will also maybe encourage others to join that line of work or to even directly go to us and ask for collaboration in a specific scientific field. What else? When we come to innovation, this should, of course, depending on the project focus, also trigger investment and innovation. So we sometimes depends on the project type, but a lot of projects are actually developing concrete services like digital platforms, for example, for that they also want to maintain after the project ends. So our job is also to make these findings and these outcomes visible and to ensure the sustainability through triggering investment, through triggering maybe interest in them. So customers might actually approach a specific company or a specific group of people for that. And of course, also to maybe generate market access if these are scientists who want to enter the market but have not entered it yet. So this is also part of our work to make it visible and to boost that visibility in order for them to be able to enter the market and to, of course, strengthen their competitiveness on the market itself. Then we're talking about the EU. When we're talking about the EU, we are always talking about global challenges as well. So the EU is not a commercial actor, right? So it is an actor who's interested in pushing certain research topics in order to advance the European economy and to European research. So we also emphasize in communication the social impact of innovations and of course also the adoption of certain technologies. AI, it's not a technology per se, something that's used in a lot of key technologies, but AI is a very, let's say, a common theme when it comes to maybe fear of people. So people might not trust AI. They might not be willing to take technologies that work with it. So our job is also to lessen that fear and to enable to get to know a certain technology, for example, and thereby maybe also trigger paradigm shift. This can relate to technology, but it might also relate to CO2 reduction, for example. So we have one project where we are talking about scope 1 to scope 3 emissions. So here it is very much about to promote greener solutions in logistics, for example, and thereby also trigger a paradigm shift, not only in economy, but also in society as a whole. I've talked quite generally about what communication means for innovation outside EU projects. But now the question is, what role does innovation and science play in terms of communication in EU projects more specifically? So if we're not talking about EU projects, communication is very much a choice. You can decide whether you want to communicate about something or not. You might have an interest in it. You might want to wait for a couple more months or for a year, depending on what your innovation, what stage your innovation is. When you're in an EU project, actually, you don't really have a choice. So actually, the choice becomes an obligation. You have to communicate on the innovation, the science that you're developing in the project. And this actually, I'm emphasizing this because sometimes it does come as a surprise, not always a pleasant one maybe, and then you're in the discussion of what to communicate, how to communicate, because there can be very sensitive issues that are connected to an innovation or a research work, but we'll come to that afterwards. But just to say that beforehand, the EU, whenever you're in a EU project, will oblige you to communicate, and we will come to the why of that in a minute. So why does the EU force us to communicate in EU projects? It forces us because, relating to what I said before, it has actually an interest in bringing back the scientific knowledge developed in projects back to society. Why? Because the EU citizens are the ones who are giving the money basically in form of taxes to the EU. So bringing it back to the citizens in form of knowledge, in form of communication, this is actually something that's kind of the give back of the money that the EU citizens are investing in research. So this is a twofold exchange, let's say. Then, of course, as I said before, the EU also wants to trigger interest in certain research topics of the broader public. They want maybe citizens to be more active and to be more engaged in some topics. And how do we do that? Also by communicating on the topics that are prevalent in the EU projects, about the social impacts that are connected to them. And that's how we trigger the interest of the public that is out there. And as I said before, this is not a one-way street. This is actually a two-way dialogue, which you want to create, and thereby not only raise the interest of the public or other researchers or the industry, but actually also make it an active conversation. So we expect them, or we want them to engage in a way that they come back to us, ask more questions, or even maybe challenge some things that we are doing. So this is also supposed to be a dialogue that we create. As I said before, the trust and the need for trust and the need to prevent misinformation. So again, here we want to build trust in new technologies and maybe also sometimes regulations. So I think most of you might know the EU in terms of regulations, which might not always be the most pleasant way of getting to know the EU, admittedly. But what is also part of most of the project is actually to explore a certain regulation and to make it understandable for companies maybe, and maybe also for researchers, to showcase what consequences it might have and how, if they're not good consequences, how they can be softened, what tools they are available in order to maybe address them better. So this is also a way from the EU to explain maybe what they are doing and to have a way of deciphering regulation, for example. And I've mentioned here two that might be very known to you, just the CSRD and EFTI. Then we have the science collaboration. As I said before, the EU does have an interest in connecting scientists, and they do that by demanding basically open access of the work that we're doing in the project. By making open access an obligation, publications, for example, are accessible to any researcher out there, and findings are accessible to researchers out there. Also because the EU has an interest in them to pick up that work and integrate it into new work, so they can progress a certain topic maybe further scientifically, but also in technical terms. Then also for pushing of the scientific careers, and this is also possible because through the project a network is created, which also benefits, for example, PhDs that are working in the project, which might also interest other scientists maybe to join the project, and of course also offers collaboration opportunities maybe with other scientists. Then regarding the investment in innovation, as I said before, depending on the type of EU project, actually innovations are developed, and new products or services are developed, and those of course should be sustainable, and therefore there needs to be an interest in like a commercial interest in using them further. So this is also part of our communication job, let's say. And of course, then also raise the visibility. Oops, sorry. Relating to the global challenges, so the EU is very much interested in tackling the challenges out there, from digitalization to automation in manufacturing, for example, to very much reducing CO2 in the CO2 heavy industries. So any EU project and communication automatically also works towards tackling these challenges and kind of making it known that the project is doing that and offering these solutions to other stakeholders out there. And as I said before, as the EU is not a commercial actor, they are also interested in emphasizing the social impact I'm sorry, of the challenges and the innovations that try maybe to solve them. And here we have again CO2 reduction, maybe energy efficiency, maybe the use of AI. It is the EU, so we are in EU lingo. When we're talking about innovation, the EU actually talks about three things. So we're talking about communication, we're talking about dissemination, and we're talking about exploitation. To decipher that a bit, communication is very much talking about the project activities, talking about the project outputs, talking about the background of the project. So what topic are we actually handling? And when we're talking about communication, we are talking about, talking to the general public, and I always say from the scientist to the grandparent. So we're not differentiating here. When we're communicating in terms of EU lingo, we're talking to a non-specified general public audience, which can consist also of researchers, but it might also be your next door neighbor. So the communication here is very broad, it's quite unspecific, but it tries to bring the bigger picture to the public. When talking about dissemination, we're actually talking about very target-oriented type of communication. I know about the lingo is a bit misleading, but dissemination are specialized audiences such as researchers. It might be technical audiences, might be software developers in that case. It might be a certain type of industry stakeholder. It might be policy stakeholders. So we are talking to specialized audiences who are usually themselves active in the topic that the project is active in. So the communication strategy is target-oriented, is tailored, and has a different language and has different communication channels. Then exploitation, I've listed it here, although it's technically seen not communication, but exploitation actually, is supported by both communication and dissemination, as it is related to taking the results of the project and using them. And as I said before, the EU is very much interested in broad use of the results and sustainability of the results. So we actually want to encourage a lot of stakeholders to take these results up. And I think the first thing when I'm talking about results that you relate to is maybe something like patents or certain, as I said before, platforms or products. But actually it can be a lot of things coming out of the project. So it might be contribution to standardization, it might be patent. It is for sure publications that are developed within the project. It could be workshop tools. A lot of times it's also policy recommendation. And how does this relate to communication? Again, we are boosting the visibility of these results in order for others to trigger uptake. So we want others to know about these results in order for them to use them further. Because otherwise, if you don't communicate science, it basically stays invisible. Innovation as well. If you're interested in it staying invisible, that's good. But if you actually want people to work with it, you have an interest in making it as known as possible. And that's why communication, dissemination work towards exploitation. So that was a short escape into the EU lingo world, just to show you the variety of stakeholders that we're dealing with and the variety of outputs that we're actually communicating about. So my question to you is, I hope that is fine, Luis, that I can ask the audience maybe to give me some feedback. Is that fine?
Yeah, of course.
Perfect. So I would like to ask you the question, what do you think of when we're talking about communication? What is the first kind of picture or activity that comes to your mind? I'm not sure, are the microphones open or are they able to speak?
They can use the chat, but if they want to speak, they just need to raise the hand and I open the mic.
Perfect, thank you.
I think about various people being involved.
Thank you. Okay, it's an after work session. So perfectly fine. You can just lay back and I'll give you a hint basically. So what I think classic communication to most people looks like is this. I think most people think about social media, so LinkedIn, which is true. That is definitely part of our communication. They might think about a video explaining a certain technology, or in that case, explaining a project. That is also very much true. They might think about a website, definitely also in the package. They might think about a newsletter or any news article, maybe even local news. That is also part of the communication in EU projects. Now let's think a bit further, because I've shown you the target audiences that we have. What you might also think of is actually conferences, so scientific conferences or trade fairs where a certain solution is presented. That is definitely part of communication in new projects. So the research results are brought to a more popular stage where there's a lot of related scientists who this way, of course, get to know the project and the innovations that are developed, or even the research work that is developed, or trade fairs where you can maybe exhibit a certain product. So I'm, for example, involved in a robotics project. If you have something like a prototype of a robot, you might take that to a conference and actually exhibit it, and thereby, of course, raise the visibility and maybe the interest in its further development, and maybe even in its use. Another form is also webinars, as this one is, for example. So we might have a webinar in order to communicate on an EU project or on the progress in an EU project. So this is another form of communication that doesn't come to mind first, maybe when we're talking about it. And these are kind of my special cases, which I just wanted to give you a round of, let's say an overview. So we have here 4 different projects with 4 different ways of, let's say, special communication. So you have on the left-hand side where you can see the logo of SUSMAC Pro. This is a project dealing with recycling of magnets. You don't have to know anything about it, but just to say, so the format here used was a roadshow. And the idea of this roadshow was to go from one city to another to demonstrate these rare earth metals and how they, why they should be recycled and in what products you can actually find them. So people were, for example, asked to deconstruct computers, laptops, in order to find those magnets. So this is one way of communicating. It's not maybe directly coming to mind when we're talking about project communication, but it's very effective because it actually engage people directly, and you can show them firsthand what we are talking about in a certain project. That is not always possible. But sometimes if we have the opportunity, that is a nice way of exchanging with the audience very closely and disseminating that topic to a broader public. Then if you go below that one, we have Admiral, which is a project that I'm handling at the moment, which is actually on logistics and transports and digitalization. So the example here was a student course. So we had a cooperation with the design school. So not very much maybe related at first sight to transport and logistics, but they were actually given a challenge coming from Admiral, so coming from our project related transport and logistics, but also to service design, and we're solving that challenge. So this is also a form of how projects can communicate, in this case, to students and to professors. Then further on, we have Biofiber Loop. Here, this project is at a Girls' Day. So basically, my colleagues here were taking that project to a school where they had a Girls' Day, so where girls can get to know technical topics a bit closer, talking to them directly, explaining to them, in that case, recyclable textiles is also a very different topic, but also on a in a hands-on way in order to make the topics more relatable and not as abstract as they would be if I would only speak about them. So here again, another way of communicating. And on the very right-hand side, you can see a coloring book for children, which was made in a project H2 Glass. Here it is about decarbonizing the glass industry, and what you can see is an electrolyzer in a very childlike way painted, because the audience are pupils and definitely non-scientific audiences, not even professional audiences. So you can see here very different examples of communication, and also tailored communication to a specific audience. The children's book is, for example, something that we give to children, of course, whereas the roadshow is something that can be related to non-technical audiences and to the general public. So here we have different ways of adapting to our audience as well. Now coming to the challenges of science communication. For example, open science versus confidentiality. I promoted before open science as a very nice way of spreading research work further and fostering science collaboration. While that is very much true, scientists as well as innovators, so technical innovators, are usually not that happy about that, because of course you want to keep your data private. You might be worried about commercial misuse, let's say, of the innovation. So communication really has to balance out between communicate on the project and on the work that is developed, but also be very, very protective of sensitive data, of maybe communicating too early on an innovation, of using visual material in a certain way and not in another, not to show too much. So when we're communicating, we have to take care also of all these aspects in order not to jeopardize commercial interest or scientific interest. Then we have the case of breaking down a scientific or technical topic in a media logic, which is almost contradictory, because media works in a very different way. So usually we have to deal with a short attention span. We have to deal with simple language, and we have to be careful to communicate in a way that is very clear to prevent misinformation. This is not how you would usually communicate about science. You have normally a professional language that you're using, or technical language. You would need more time actually to explore these topics, to really make them understandable. So you always have to find the balance between deconstructing the complexity while also still making it as scientific as possible. So there's always a balance to be struck between these two when we're communicating. Then I've talked about the distrust and misinformation. This is a challenge not only because there's a lot of media and a lot of news out there all the time, but also because you need to create trust and transparency from the start of the project. So our job is very much to be a trusted source of information, and you can only do that by staying very consistent, very scientific, continuously. So over a longer period of time, people start to trust in what you're communicating about, and that information is true and legitimate, because there's a lot of contesters usually on a certain knowledge. It also depends on the topic, of course. There might be less competition over who's right and who's wrong, and I'm not sure, CO2 reduction usually, but I, for example, had a project on COVID-19. So you can imagine that there was a lot of contesters to certain views. So we had to be very sensitive how we communicated and how we dealt also with comments that were going into a misinterpretation line. Then, of course, as I said, you have to address skepticism that is raised and also survive in an information flood. So stay consistent, stay scientific, still make it interesting and still make it attractive for people to even look at it. So again, quite a balance to hold up. Now the best practices. So what should you do when you're communicating science and innovation? Know your audience. So be very aware of what your audience likes, about the language they talk in, about the channels they are using, and tailor your content to that audience. Also, try to create an added value. So don't just fill your whatever channel with some information randomly, because then people will not come back to that channel. You have to stay consistent also in the quality that you're delivering for that specific audience, because that might be a different quality for different audiences. then very simply said, be multimedia open, be multimedia talented, because it is like that. We humans like to have a lot of different formats to stay entertained. Even though we might have a scientific interest or technical interest in something, honestly speaking, you will still be more prone to listen to something if it is presented to you in different formats and is attractive for you to listen to. And as I think repeatedly said, hopefully not too much, is stay transparent and stay consistent in how you're communicating. That means when you have an innovation, for example, that is developed from an early stage to the finalization stage, take your audience along that path. So make them understand what your starting point, for example, was, how you developed from there to another starter, to another point, to the next milestone until the finish line. That will create trust in what you're doing, and of course will also create trust in the transparency that you're delivering consistently. Then emphasize societal relevance. Why? Because that will make people connected to a topic or a project in that case. So if they find your topic relevant and attractive, they will stay with you. If they think they are not connected to it, they will automatically not listen. You will not have a problem with, usually, with technical or scientific audiences, because by the nature of their work, they will be interested. But when we're talking about the so-called general public, as the EU projects always pose it, you might lose interest very quickly when we're just talking about, you know, the usual EU citizen or your next door neighbor. So we can only hold that interest if we emphasize that that the topic has a connection to their world. That's what I mean by social relevance. Time is of the essence. Usually when we say this phrase, we mean do things very quickly in a very short time span. I mean the opposite. Take your time. So don't rush. Try to test a little bit, experiment with different communication formats, because you might not always know what channel might be the best one, what format might be the best one when you're communicating. It might be something that only time can show. And I think there's a lot of value in having the courage to experiment a little bit and kind of take your own findings, your own best practices from there and use them. But you can only find out if you try. Otherwise, you will just do the usual and stay with that. You can do that. But if you want to excel, that's definitely the way to go. And finally, so there is a German saying, I'm not sure you can actually translate it that way, but the German saying goes, talking is silver, silence is gold. So the question is that the case? Should we communicate? Is there an interest in communicating? The EU definitely says yes. And I think there is a very high value in that, because we're talking about taxpayer money, we're talking about bringing something back to the society that has invested basically in this kind of research. But the question is, why should you communicate? It is much about visibility. So as long as you don't communicate, things will stay invisible. Any research work will stay invisible. Any innovation you're doing will stay invisible. If you're communicating a little bit, it might be not enough to gather interest. So I do think there's a high value in communicating if you're doing it in a relevant way, if you're doing it in an accessible way, in an understandable way, in a tailored way. Of course, this is all about timing. So when it comes to your innovation, which you are developing, it should be a good timing. Is it the best timing now to start communicating or to start communicating in depth? Might be that you have to wait for a little while. I just wanted to emphasize communication has a high value, but it has to come at the right time, and maybe also broadened at the right time, and then can really maximize your visibility and also your maybe customer, attract your customer to your product, and finally excel your innovation. So that was about my presentation. I hope that it has given you something to take home after a day's work. And yes, I'm open for questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for this clear and intuitive presentation. You remind us that communication is just not about promotion, or it's a strategic tool to support an understanding and trust and options of innovation. So thank you again for sharing your work and knowledge with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
This is very interesting, because Next Academy is inside of Agenda Next is a project that need to be more communicated, for example, in several issues. And this is inspiring for us to observe and to see what we are doing well and not so good, and what we need to improve in this stage. So let's now open the floor for your questions and comments. As I said before, feel free to use the chat or raise your hand if you want to make want to speak. I am going to open the mic to who we needed to speak. Okay. I think I have something here. I'm going to start with prepare some questions, and then I want to see. Jacqueline, what are the most common mistakes when communicating innovation in the new projects? What is your experience? Because I believe you have seen a lot of things.
I think it's a lot about timing. So the mistakes might come really in terms of too early to communicate too early on, to communicate maybe not about, also content-wise. If you can have a low effort content at first, because maybe the project has not started running properly. So you have to maybe introduce the project for some time in its general terms, but it has to become specific at some point. If you don't make what you're communicating specific early enough, I think you will lose interest. Because of course, anybody who listens in, who takes their time to maybe read your post or read your newsletter or watch your video, they want an added value from that. If they don't get that, you will lose them. So I think it's very much about timing and also always keeping in mind to have an added value for your audience.
Do you think you need to repeat the strategy along the time? You need to come again with the communication and in all the platforms of communication or the channels, or just one time, two times, and then you wait?
You mean the frequency of communication?
The frequency, yeah.
I think it very much depends on also what you're communicating about, and also on the channel itself. So LinkedIn, for example, is I think one of the most common channels that we're using to communicate on. I think companies are using it, researchers are using it, actually quite broadly. So here I would say it is good to be consistent, so not to communicate for too long of a time. It's really like a balancing out. Of course, if you don't have any content, why should you communicate, right? But that, again, if you don't communicate for a long time, people will also lose sight of you. So while the content is important, you definitely should, I think, show up basically to that stage and make people constantly aware that you are there, because otherwise you lose them too. But still, like I said, if you don't have any content, it might not make sense. So it really depends also on what type of stakeholder you are. So researchers usually they post when they have a publication, they post when they have an event or a conference, and I think there it makes a lot of sense to communicate a lot. And then it's fine to have a gap in between, because their line of work is very much focused on these momentums, right? So they will, when they go to a conference, they should definitely announce, I'm going to that conference. Why? Because then all the other researchers also going to that specific conference will know that they can meet you there. They might find you at that event, but they might not find you if they don't know that you're there and won't talk to you there. So I think it's around these momentums. For researchers, for example, it makes a lot of sense to communicate stronger. It might make less sense to do that in between these momentums.
What are the tools or formats that tend to work best in your experience?
So again, very much depending on the target audience, but kind of the hardest to catch audience is, I think, because it's very general, is the general public. because you have so much information floating around, from podcasts to science slams to, there's a lot of offer actually out there. So to be able to position your project there and your topic there is sometimes quite tough. But I think it really, if you want to nail it down, it's very much make it relatable, make it a hands-on experience. That's what usually attracts people. That's what makes them understand the topic. So when we're talking about this general public, that's definitely what I would advise, hands-on formats. And of course, I mean, humor works very well. So if you have a science slam, usually people love that. I'm not sure how that is in Portugal. In Germany, they are quite popular, and they tend to work very well because people are actually interested in topics, and if they are presented to them in an entertaining format. And I think because this is a physical format, it also works quite nicely. You can get a drink, you can sit down. It's like an evening entertainment. And I think that's why it works. And actually then people are very open to deal with more complex topics if you give them a drink and if you give them a stage and entertainment that comes with it. That's not the only format that works. But when we're talking about general public, this is definitely something, again, tailored to the audience, right? So that's the audience you are dealing with. You have to get them interested in something. But also remember, they're not per se uninterested. Actually, quite interested people are out there. So if you have that kind of event, you will gather them. If you promote it accordingly, of course, then scientific audiences, for example, are quite easy to catch in a way because you already have scientific people working in your projects, and they have their scientific field and are usually known in their scientific field. So the moment you go to conferences, for example, scientific results become quite known and they have their own network. So this one is actually quite straightforward and works very well. So I would say the hardest to catch ones are the out of the box people who are not automatically interested in what you're doing in a way. And then of course, if you're developing a product or a service, that's where it becomes tricky with the commercial stakeholders, let's say, because there's competition out there. So here again, for the communication, while we are not the developers of a certain innovation, we definitely have to be quite aware of the context that we're communicating in, because that will depend on how, for example, we communicate in a way that might not lead to a product being taken for another product. So if there is a competitor out there, we have to know what the differences are between their product and our product. So we are not communicating in the same way. We have to then differentiate what differentiates our product from the other. So there's actually a lot of I'm not sure how to say this, superficial but in-depth knowledge you have to have. So we're not the researchers, we're not the industry stakeholders, but we have to have kind of the broad overview and sometimes for certain points the in-depth view on things in order to communicate properly and effectively.
Very interesting. My last question is, because I don't see any questions for the audience, is related with you requires communication in all innovation projects. But in your experience, is this really working? This obligation that you put in the projects? Do you feel that?
I do think so. Yeah, I actually do think so. It does work. So in your project, it's quite specific. So we're talking about external.
I was asking it's increasing the collaboration. I believe so.
Yeah. For sure. So there's external communication, where we're really talking about reaching out to external audiences. That's the ones I've actually presented within the presentation. This is working, of course, best because your projects are always a team. We're not talking about one single person, right? We're talking about a team of people, so the so-called consortium or project partners that are standing behind the project. And your first job as a communicator is actually to convince and to work together with that team so they are pushing you to communicate. If I don't have the commitment of my project partners, it is almost impossible for me to communicate, because then I don't have the content and I don't have the very interesting stuff that actually makes it attractive to read my posts, to listen to a podcast I might be creating. So the first thing you actually have to perfectionate, let's say, is to gather your project partners behind you, to create added value for them. And when you have that, then you can communicate very well, I think, with external audiences. And I do think it works, because it's very nice to see actually how people react if you tailor the messages in a way that will create added value for them. If they take, if you take each other seriously in a way. And it actually does work, I would say, yeah.
Great. So let me see. I don't see more questions. I believe we finished. So thank you all for joining us today, and a big thank to you, Jacqueline, for showing us how to communicate can truly boost the impact of our innovation. We
Very
look
welcome.
forward to see you perhaps in the third edition. We're gonna think what we're gonna do. And for everyone, I hope to see you again next Wednesday for the final session of this second edition with Peter Delegan, who will talk about support innovation system. So I see you there. Okay. Thank you, Jacqueline, again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay. You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you to both of you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you too.